What is history, and how do we make sense of the vast and chaotic record of human experience? This lecture explores the foundations of historical study by examining how historians interpret evidence, divide the past into meaningful units, and navigate diverse systems of timekeeping. We began by analyzing what it means to write history, a process that is never neutral. Historians select and interpret primary sources through the lens of their own time, values, and questions, producing narratives that are always shaped by context. Central to organizing historical knowledge is the concept of periodization, dividing history into discrete blocks of time with descriptive labels like the Middle Ages or the Industrial Era. Although useful, these divisions are inherently arbitrary and often reflect a Western-centric perspective that does not always translate across cultures. We will examine the tensions and limitations of these temporal frameworks, including how historians of world history attempt to systematize global narratives while wrestling with inherited Eurocentric models. The second half of the lecture considers how calendars and dating systems influence our understanding of historical chronology, from the Julian and Gregorian reforms in Europe to the Islamic, Hindu, and Mayan calendars used around the world. We will explore the diversity of timekeeping systems and the consequences of adopting the Gregorian calendar as the global standard. We will also reflect on how the shift from Anno Domini to Common Era terminology reflects broader debates about religion, secularism, and inclusivity in historical scholarship. By the end of the lecture, you will better understand the intellectual challenges of splitting history and how the tools historians use, periodization, primary sources, and dating systems, both illuminate and complicate our efforts to interpret the past. The word history comes ultimately from ancient Greek historia, meaning inquiry, knowledge from inquiry, or judge. However, the question of what kind of inquiries historians pose, what knowledge they seek, and how they interpret the evidence they find remains controversial. Historians draw conclusions from the past approaches to history, but in the end, they always write in the context of their own time, current dominant ideas of how to interpret the past, and even subjective viewpoints. Furthermore, current events and developments often trigger which past events, historical periods, or geographical regions are seen as critical and thus should be investigated. Finally, historical studies are designed to provide specific lessons for societies today. In the words of Benedetto Croce, Italian philosopher and historian, all history is contemporary history. All events that are remembered and preserved in some original form constitute the historical record. The task of historians is to identify the sources that can most usefully contribute to the production of accurate accounts of the past. These sources, known as primary sources or evidence, were produced at the time under study and constitute the foundation of historical inquiry. Ideally, a historian will use as many available primary sources as can be accessed, but in practice, sources may have been destroyed or may not be available for research. In some cases, the only eyewitness reports of an event may be memoirs, autobiographies, or oral interviews taken years later. Sometimes the only evidence relating to an event or person in the distant past was written or copied decades or centuries later. Historians remain cautious when working with evidence recorded years or even decades or centuries after an event. This kind of evidence poses the question of to what extent witnesses remember events accurately. However, historians also point out that hardly any historical evidence can be seen as objective, as it is always a product of particular individuals, times, and dominant ideas. This is also why researchers try to find as many records of an event under investigation as possible, and it's not unusual that they find evidence that may present contradictory accounts of the same events. In general, the sources of historical knowledge can be separated into three categories: what is written, what is said, and what is physically preserved. Historians often consult all three. Periodization is the process of categorizing the past into discrete, quantified, named blocks of time in order to facilitate the study and analysis of history. This results in descriptive abstractions that provide convenient terms for periods of time with relatively stable characteristics. To the extent that history is continuous and cannot be generalized, all systems of periodization are arbitrary. Moreover, determining the precise beginning and ending to any period is also a matter of arbitrary decisions. Eventually, periodizing labels are a reflection of a very particular cultural and geographical perspective, as well as specific subfields or themes of history, e.g., military history, social history, political history, intellectual history, or cultural history. Consequently, not only do periodizing blocks inevitably overlap, but they also often seemingly conflict with or contradict one another. Some have a cultural usage, like the Gilded Age. Others refer to prominent historical events, the interwar years, 1918 to 1939. Yet others are defined by decimal numbering systems, the 1960s or the 17th century. Other periods are named after influential individuals whose impact may or may not have reached beyond certain geographic regions, like the Victorian era, the Edwardian era, the Napoleonic era. The common general split between prehistory, before written history, ancient history, Middle Ages, modern history, and contemporary history is a Western division of the largest blocks of time agreed upon by Western historians and representing the Western point of view. For example, the history of Asia or Africa cannot be neatly categorized following these periods. However, even within this largely accepted division, the perspective of specific national developments and experiences often divides Western historians, as some periodizing labels will be applicable only to particular regions. This is especially true of labels derived from individuals or ruling dynasties, such as the Jacksonian era in the United States, or the Merovingian period in France. Cultural terms may also have a limited, even if larger, reach. For example, the concept of the Romantic period is largely meaningless outside of Europe and European-influenced cultures. Even within those areas, different European religions may mark the beginning and the ending points of Romanticism differently. Likewise, the 1960s, although technically applicable to anywhere in the world according to the Common Era numbering, has a certain set of specific cultural connotations in certain countries, including sexual revolution, counterculture, or youth rebellion. However, those never emerged in certain regions, like in Spain under Francisco Franco's authoritarian regime. Some historians have also noted that in the 1960s, a descriptive historical period actually began in the late 1950s and ended in the early 1970s because the cultural and economic conditions that define the meaning of the period dominated longer than the actual decade of the 1960s. Methods of timekeeping can be reconstructed for the prehistoric period from at least the Neolithic period. The natural units for timekeeping used by most historical societies are the day, the solar year, and the lunation. The first recorded calendars date to the Bronze Age and include the Egyptian and Sumerian calendars. A larger number of calendar systems of the ancient Near East became accessible in the Iron Age and were based on the Babylonian calendar. One of these was the calendar of the Persian Empire, which in turn gave rise to the Zoroastrian calendar, as well as the Hebrew calendar. A great number of Hellenic calendars were developed in classical Greece and influenced calendars outside of the immediate sphere of Greek influence. These gave rise to the various Hindu calendars, as well as to the ancient Roman calendar, which contained very ancient remnants of a pre-Etruscan 10-month solar year. The Roman calendar was reformed by Julius Caesar in 45 BCE. The Julian calendar was no longer dependent on the observation of the new moon, but simply followed an algorithm of introducing a leap day every 4 years. This created a disassociation of the calendar month from the lunation. The Gregorian calendar was introduced as a refinement of the Julian calendar in 1582 and is today in worldwide use as the de facto calendar for secular purposes. Despite various calendars used across millennia, cultures, and geographical regions, Western historical scholarship has unified the standards of determining dates based on the dominant Gregorian calendar. Regardless of what historical period or geographical areas Western historians investigate and write about, they adjust dates from the original timekeeping system to the Gregorian calendar. Occasionally, some historians decide to use both dates, the dates recorded under the original calendar used, and the date adjusted to the Gregorian calendar, easily recognizable to the Western student of history. The Old Roman year had 304 days divided into 10 months, beginning with March. However, the ancient historian Livy gave credit to the second ancient Roman king, Numa Pompilius, for devising a calendar of 12 months. The extra months, Ianuarius and Februarius, had been invented supposedly by Numa Pompilius as stopgaps. Julius Caesar realized that the system had become inoperable, so he effected drastic changes in the year of his third consulship. The new year in 709 AUC, Ab Urbe Condita, the year from the founding of the city of Rome, began on January 1st and ran over 365 days until December 31st. Further adjustments were made under Augustus, who introduced the concept of the leap year in 737 AUC, or 4 CE. The resultant Julian calendar remained in almost universal use in Europe until 1582. Marcus Terentius Varro introduced the Ab Urbe Condita epoch, assuming a foundation of Rome in 753 BCE. The system remained in use during the early medieval period until the widespread adoption of the Dionysian era in the Carolingian period. The 7-day week has a tradition reaching back to the ancient Near East, but the introduction of the planetary week, which remains in modern use, dates to the Roman Empire period. The Gregorian calendar, also called the Western calendar and the Christian calendar, is internationally the most widely used civil calendar today. It is named after Pope Gregory XIII, who introduced it in October of 1582. The calendar was a refinement of the Julian calendar, amounting to a 0.002% correction in the length of the year. The motivation for the reform was to stop the drift of the calendar with respect to the equinoxes and solstices, particularly the vernal equinox, which set the date for Easter celebrations. Transition to the Gregorian calendar would restore the holiday to the time of year in which it was celebrated when introduced by the early church. The reform was adopted initially by the Catholic countries of Europe. Protestants and Eastern Orthodox countries continued to use the traditional Julian calendar and eventually adopted the Gregorian reform for the sake of convenience in international trade. The last European country to adopt the reform was Greece in 1923. During the period between 1582, when the first countries adopted the Gregorian calendar, and 1923, when the last European country adopted it, it was often necessary to indicate the date of some event in both the Julian calendar and the Gregorian calendar. Even before 1582, the year sometimes had to be double dated because of the different beginnings of the year in various countries. While the European Gregorian calendar eventually dominated the world in historiography, a number of other calendars have shaped timekeeping systems that are still influential in some regions of the world. The Islamic calendar determines the first year in 622 CE, during which the immigration of Muhammad from Mecca to Medina, known as the Hijra, occurred. It is used to date events in many Muslim countries, concurrently with the Gregorian calendar, and is used by Muslims everywhere to determine the proper days on which to observe and celebrate Islamic religious practices like fasting, holidays, and festivals. Various Hindu calendars developed in the medieval period with Gupta-era astronomy as their common basis. Some of the more prominent regional Hindu calendars include the Nepali calendar, Assamese calendar, Bengali calendar, Malayalam calendar, Tamil calendar, the Vikrama Samvat used in northern India, and the Shalivahana calendar. The common feature of all regional Hindu calendars is that the names of the 12 months are the same, because the names are based in Sanskrit, although the spelling and pronunciation have come to vary slightly from region to region over thousands of years. The month that starts the year also varies from region to region. The Buddhist calendar and the traditional luni-solar calendars of Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, Sri Lanka, and Thailand are also based on an older version of the Hindu calendar. Of all the ancient calendar systems, the Mayan and other Mesoamerican systems are the most complex. The Mayan calendar has 2 years, the 260-day sacred round or Tzolk'in, and the 360-day vague year or Hab. The essentials of the Mayan calendar are based upon a system that was in common use throughout the region, dating back to at least the 5th century BCE. It shares many aspects with calendars employed by other earlier Mesoamerican civilizations, such as the Zapotec and Olmec, and contemporary or later ones, such as the Mixtec and Aztec calendars. The Mayan calendar is still used in many modern communities in the Guatemalan highlands, Veracruz, Oaxaca, and Chiapas, Mexico. The terms Anno Domini AD and Before Christ BC are used to label or number years in the Julian and Gregorian calendars. The term Anno Domini is medieval Latin, which means in the year of the Lord, but is often translated as in the year of our Lord. It is occasionally set out more fully as Anno Domini Nostri Jesu, or Jesu Christi, in the year of our Lord Jesus Christ. Dionysius Exiguus of Scythia Minor introduced the AD system in AD 525, counting the years since the birth of Christ. This calendar era is based on the traditionally recognized year of the conception or birth of Jesus of Nazareth, with AD counting years after the start of this epoch and BC denoting years before the start of the era. There is no year 0 in this scheme, so the year AD 1 immediately follows the year 1 BC. This dating system was devised in 525 but was not widely used until after 1800. A calendar era that is often used as an alternative naming of the Anno Domini is Common Era or Current Era, abbreviated CE. The system uses BCE as an abbreviation for Before the Common Era or Current Era. The CE-BCE designation uses the same numeric values as the AD-BC system, so the two notations, CE or BCE and AD or BC, are numerically equivalent. The expression Common Era can be found as early as 1708 in English and traced back to Latin usage among European Christians to 1615 as Vulgaris Erae and to 1635 in English as Vulgar Era. Since the later 20th century, the use of CE and BCE have been popularized in academic and scientific publications and more generally by authors and publishers wishing to emphasize secularism or sensitivity to non-Christians, because the system does not explicitly make use of religious titles for Jesus, such as Christ and Dominus, Lord, which are used in the BC AD notation. Nor does it give implicit expression to the Christian creed that Jesus is the Christ. While both systems are thus an accepted standard, the CE-BCE system is more neutral and inclusive of non-Christian perspectives.